Okay, this is like the first time in possibly years that I'm actually doing this, but I'm actually going to talk a little bit about politics. And it'll be on an international level, but also on a local level as well. But if you thought that the relationship talk would end, nope, nope, nope. There's still quite a bit of it here. And this episode is definitely going to have a bunch of marriage talk, a bunch of masculinity talk, and, at least in my opinion, not enough ass. But before I can get into any of that, I first need to start things out by engaging in my first, can I call it a political story? But it's more or less the first thing that I need to deal with, and it is coming from North Korea. Now, Kim Jong-un was very recently spotted crying as he begged the women of North Korea to help in halting a decline in the country's birth rate. Which, to be quite honest, sounded like bullshit when I read it initially, sometime towards the end of last year, mainly because I felt like there were a couple of things that were particularly wild. One of them being the fact that Kim Jong un was begging North Korean women. Like, that in and itself is wild. Then, secondly, but more importantly, this nigga can cry?
The royal penis is clean, Your Highness.
Alright, let's just get this straight. I'm not saying that it's, inhuman or wrong for Kim Jong-un to cry or for men to cry or anything. It's just, this is Kim Jong-un. Like, by the time people are telling you about Kim Jong-un, this guy doesn't sound like he even cried when he came out the womb. Like, he probably came out busy barking orders for people to clothe him because he was feeling cold. But the fact that this guy was supposedly weeping as he was addressing the women of North Korea just seems a little bit wild to me. But anyways, let me just read the caption that came with the story because it was particularly short. So it says, and I quote, Kim Jong-un burst into tears in front of thousands of North Korean mothers as he begged them to have more babies and stop the decline in the country's birth rate. The dictator was seen dabbing his eyes with a handkerchief in a plea to women gathered at a national mothers meeting in Pyongyang. The United Nations Population Fund estimates that as of 2023, the fertility rate, or the average number of children being born to a woman in North Korea, stood at 1.8 amid an extended fall in the rate during recent decades. End quote. Okay, this guy seemingly seemed to beg and seemingly seemed to cry for women to start having more children. Which is, to be quite honest, a little bit wild in my opinion. Just mostly because I've never known Kim Jong-un to particularly beg. Like, dude seems like the type of person to get horny and immediately order the pussy to get wet. Not even ask for sex from the shorty. Also, it's a bit weird in his case that they're having a population decline because I know globally we've been having a population crisis that people aren't really acknowledging, but at least on a global level we can blame shit like social media and Tinder and hookup culture and access to technology that's making people who are into gaming a little bit more docile, but these niggas don't have the modern tech to do that shit. So, besides lacking basic needs, which he could have provided very easily, what the fuck is his excuse? Like, this shit wild though. But also, even wilder so than that, like, I'm finding it odd that this guy is asking mothers to have more children, yet he has access to, get this, a pleasure squad which consists of girls who are 13 to 16 years old whose sole duty is to entertain him as well as other government officials. Now, I'm not saying that he should fucking make kids with them because, they're still kids, the whole consent thing, statutory rape and all that, but I'm trying to think about it. By the time you have been going to work in the government as a part of the pleasure squad, of which they usually retire when they're in their 20s and they check in there when they're virgins and they look a certain way and they talk a certain way, aren't you telling me that a bunch of dudes in North Korea are gonna be looking at these babes in the same way red pillars look in there like, oh, these hoes out in the streets, they waste their 20s busy fucking all the rando dudes, blah, blah, they're in the streets, blah, blah. Like, what do you think was going to happen? Like, dude is single-handedly reducing the number of eligible women in the future in the thousands, and then he's coming back to complain while he's still making life miserable for the actual mothers that apparently they're not having kids. I don't know. Like, the way I'm looking at it, it's like this dude is doing everything wrong and still crying about the same issue. which probably I shouldn't have used to start this podcast because it almost sounds like I'm a little bit bitter, which I'm not. Because if I was, then I wouldn't be able to start the episode in such a jovial manner by saying, welcome to the Break Time Podcast, where I talk about love, sex, and relationships from a guy's perspective, as well as a bunch of other guy shit. The man on the mic is a man who still wonders what a pleasure squad is, because it legit sounds like special ops but for pussy. He's a man whose covert ops prefers one woman instead of multiple. It is none other than your tall, dark, and mildly handsome man, Sir Denver B. This episode has taken a much edgier turn than how I usually start, mostly because, yes, I know I spoke about pussy and shit, but normally it's not like I get into such topics, and I do intend on doubling down for a little bit before I get to the tweets, of which, since I hadn't mentioned initially, this is the episode where I get to hop on Twitter, or is it X, and I get to pull a couple of tweets which, discuss love, sex, relationships, and stuff like that, and I break them down a little bit. And this is one of those episodes where, the contribution of the fans does help quite a bit in the making of this episode, and the drill in doing it, whether you find the tweet is from X or from Facebook or from IG, and I'll explain that in a second, is pretty simple, almost sounds like a song, and it goes like this. You see that tweet, you like that tweet, you want us to discuss that tweet, you send that tweet. You send it to the DMs of @BagakaTheD, which happens to be my personal X handle. On Facebook and on IG, if it happens to be a screenshot or screen grab, ended up on a video or a reel, then the place to send it to is @The Breaktime Podcast on Facebook and @TheBreaktime_podcast on IG. The DMs are always open, and I will take it from there, and I will handle it accordingly. Now, I have a couple of tweets that I need to discuss, and like I said initially, they involve a little bit of marriage, they involve a little bit of masculinity, and just not enough ass. But before I can get to that, there's a story that I recently saw which intrigued me so much, because this is one of those cases of, if we're fucked, we're all fucked. Now, the story is actually a Nakuru-based doctor who moved to court seeking orders to have those who've been exempted from paying taxes, such as churches and so on, to actually pay the taxes, as a part of the people in this country. Now, the story reads, and it's pretty brief, so it says, and I quote, "A Nakuru-based doctor has moved to court seeking orders to have those who have been exempted from paying taxes, including churches, made to pay the levies. In his suit before the High Court in Nairobi, Magare Gikenyi wants tithes, offerings, and donations to be taxed." End quote. Alright, so I read this, and just like most people who read this particular story, I was entirely in favor with this, although not necessarily for the same exact reasons as a lot of people were. Now, a lot of people were siding with this because there has been quite the uptick in the number of churches that are coming up, and it's actually gotten to a point where churches have seemed more like businesses, more so even family businesses than anything. And you're finding that preachers, you're finding that people who are owners of churches, who've started up churches, end up becoming multi-millionaires because they get tithes and offerings, which, of course they'll use for church stuff, but a lot of which they keep for themselves. And as a result, you find that there's people who've profited from having churches, such as the Kiunas and Pastor Ngange and so on, and these guys don't pay taxes. Yet the people that are giving them the tithe and offerings are getting taxed, and to be honest, that doesn't seem particularly fair. Although my main reason for supporting it is mainly based off of the fact that a lot of these churches supported the current president, who hasn't made life for Kenyans particularly good, but the churches have enjoyed a certain amount of protection, while a lot of Kenyans have suffered quite a bit. Now, let me just try and explain it like this. Before our current president was the president, he had a lot of not so clean money that he laundered through churches so that he could clean them into the system, of which he got them back for himself. Now, as a result, the guy, came out, and one of the personas that he used was that he's this God-fearing church person who doesn't drink blah blah, unlike the last president. And when the guy clinched the victory, there were a lot of religious leaders that were on his side. They were the same people who are saying that leaders are chosen by God and not by man, and they've enjoyed a certain amount of protection. I can remember when the Nairobi governor was working on shutting down loud places around residential areas such as clubs and so on, and a lot of people tried to throw churches into the mix, of which the clubs, which generate a lot of income due to alcohol sales and people who go there and people who are paid to run the entire establishment, ended up having to close, or at least some of them ended up having to close as a result, which put a bunch of people out of work and meant a lot less alcohol was sold, so less tax was taken up, and like less money for fees and shit was collected as a result. Churches remained untouched, alright? Churches remained untouched, of which these guys do not pay taxes. And considering that some of these churches generate tens, if not even hundreds of millions in a year, if not even billions, it seems a little bit odd that the common person is going to be taxed with the few thousands that they make in a month, as opposed to the place that's making the millions or the billions. So, you know what? I think these guys should be taxed. They'll get quite a bit of money for the government, and also, if you kick them in the tithe, then they'll very easily not side with the government, more so the president, and it just works in our favor, because now if the guy has enough people against him, at least it'll mean that they will stop giving politicians this free airtime to talk to people during church functions, and also they will not try to push a certain politician's message throughout the sermons. Then again, I might be wrong about this entire thing, and maybe I don't have the full picture, but I am going to leave it at that and move it on to the tweets. So on to our very first tweet of this episode. Now, this tweet is actually a reply to another tweet where some guy mentioned that he had noticed a weird pattern where most of the guys who seemed particularly brilliant in school weren't getting married or even having kids, 4 or 5 years down the lane after school, and most of them were seeming between jobs and was asking why. So the guy who responded said, and I quote, "We refuse to slave away like the rest of you. About marriage, given that like 50% of marriages fail, it's just not something to run to. I mean, if you're jumping from a plane and you're told there's a 50-50 chance the parachute will fail, would you still jump?" End quote. And honestly, I feel like this logic that he's employing here is particularly flawed, and I'm not even going to try and bring up the whole benefits of marriage and shit like that. I will argue this out with the same sort of logical mindset that he has by giving the example of business and using the statistics around new and startup businesses. Now, 50% of businesses fail within the first 5 years, of which 65.1% of them will fail over a 10-year period, of which I actually believe that 65% is now after the first 50 is gone, so there's like another more than 50% that don't last past the 5-year mark. But you know what? Either way, the stat doesn't seem particularly any better. Does it mean that people have stopped trying to set up businesses, or that people should stay employed and not set up any businesses? No, there's a lot more people that are being encouraged to start up a business today. And I know someone who's going to come and be like, oh, no, it's not accurate, blah, blah. But at the same time, his statistics aren't accurate either. He's using US statistics and he's in Kenya. I'm using US statistics and I'm in Kenya, where the chances of you succeeding with a startup business are even worse than the US. But guess what? There's people who are still starting businesses day in, day out. So are you telling me that if a report came out stating that the chances of a Kenyan business failing in Kenya within the first 5 years is at 70%, that you wouldn't start a business? Like, at the end of the day, you'll still find a bunch of these same people trying to start businesses. It's not like they're trying to stay employed, especially considering that his very first statement was, "We refuse to slave away like the rest of you." And you kind of wonder, like, if dude is taking a risk in business, why can't you take a risk with relationships? Because either way, there's people involved, the chances of it failing aren't that low, and at the end of the day, a lot of it is very based off of the work that you put in it. So at the end of it, like, I find his argument to be particularly moot. Although granted, I also feel like the original statement didn't entirely hold too much water, because I know a lot of brilliant people who, instead of, staying unmarried for a while, got married particularly early, and they seem to be doing quite great. I even know one of them who's like 25 and already has a kid. I'd argue that a lot of these guys were probably just people who are getting A's in school and they were assumed to be brilliant, yet they were just, particularly good bookworms, and they ended up getting into professions that haven't been doing particularly well, at least in this country. So things like medicine, things like tech, things like law or engineering. So at the end of it, they will be claimed to be, these brilliant people. But if they're out of a job and, they're not married because, financial situation and whatnot, then it looks like it's this weird thing. But then again, I could be wrong about the entire thing because, I'm also existing in my own sort of bubble of knowing like 2-3 brilliant people. So I'm just going to leave it at that and move it on to our very next tweet of the episode. So the next tweet says, and I quote, "Men, many men are not yet aware of this gospel of masculinity. Relationships and marriage belong to the man. A man's natural instinct is to sleep with lots of women and commit to none. A woman's natural instinct is to have an alpha's children and get a beta to commit for provision. Listen carefully. A woman doesn't leave a man because he cheated." End quote. Okay, now, first of all, this tweet is also a reply to something that someone else said, but it can exist in its own bubble well enough that I don't need to explain the original tweet because it was more or less around the same exact thing. Now, the thing is, when I was thinking about this tweet, that last statement was one that really got me. A woman doesn't leave a man because he cheated. Like, I don't know if maybe I'm the one who might be looking at things differently, but I find that even when people talk about cheating in and of itself, like the whole concept of infidelity, is never alone as a vice whenever it comes to things that can split people apart. Like, there's things such as the disrespect that can come along with it. So for example, if your partner cheated on you and they were doing it with the other person in your house or on your bed or on your kid's bed or some shit, or use the car that you bought for them to drive to their place where they were getting it raw while they claimed that they were going some other place or they were going to meet up with people and they were completely lying to you. So there's stuff like disrespect, there's stuff like breaking trust, there's stuff like lying and disloyalty. There's always a bunch of things that infidelity will carry with it. So it's never just a case of infidelity. But all in all, even though you were to ignore that, if you're to look at whatever stats from whatever place and you look at, the reasons for divorce in a lot of places, a large chunk of the divorce filings that have been done in most places, you can look at the states, you can even look at Kenya, a lot of them will involve infidelity. So however it is you want to argue shit out about how, it wasn't just the cheating, there was more to it. At the end of the day, the divorce filing was for infidelity. A lot of times when the woman's leaving the man, or even the other way around, a lot of times it's because of infidelity. So you can't really come and say a woman doesn't leave a man because he cheated. And yet the reality of it is a lot of the times when people split, it's because of infidelity. But anyways, that said and done, earlier on the guy said relationships and marriage belong to the man, and many men aren't yet aware of this. Well, the reality of it is, yes, that's true. But at the same time, most men aren't aware of the first half of the statement that, comes along with the whole, relationships and or marriage belong to the man, which is usually women hold the keys or are the custodians of sex. It's usually almost like a package thing that you'll find a lot of people saying online, particularly under red pill forums and places where people talk about masculinity. You'll find that one of the things that they say is women hold the keys to sex, men hold the keys to the relationship, or women are the custodians of sex, men are the custodians of the relationship, of which it's a particularly true statement. It's not bullshit. Would I say that relationships and marriage belong to the man? I'd replace belong with are the custodians or hold the keys to. That makes a lot more sense as opposed to belong, which just sounds a little bit odd. But with that said, the next thing that was said was a man's natural instinct is to sleep with lots of women and commit to none. Of which, when I read this part, I can honestly say that I tried everything possible to find a way to refute what was said, at least in the first 3/4 of the entire statement, and I couldn't. So here I'll just have to agree, yes, a man's natural instinct is to sleep with lots of women, or as some people would probably call it by a more scientific term, sexual diversity. But the whole commit to none thing, I feel like men do want to commit to women. It's just that they would much rather prefer to commit to lots of women. if a lot of the guys who are cheating right now, who actively cheat on their partners, had the opportunity to commit to a bunch of these women with very minimal input, a bunch of them would do it. Like the largest chunk of them would probably do it. Because for a lot of these guys who cheat, there's some babes that they end up liking a little bit more than others, and they'd probably be okay committing to them. It's just that in a lot of those cases, the partner that they're with carries more value than them, and it becomes this massive gamble of, is it really worth dropping my current for this one, as opposed to, can I have this one as an extra person that I'm committing to? So it's mostly true, but somehow bullshit. Then the last bit, which I found to be just weird, was a woman's natural instinct is to have an alpha's children and get a beta to commit for provision, which I would like to highlight is complete bullshit. Now, a natural instinct to have an alpha's children, I'm not a woman, I can't entirely say that it's true, but for a lot of women, it was a particularly great thing to have kids for, a particularly high level individual. And, in this particular case, it's probably true. But getting a beta to commit for provision, first of all, I'm not really into the whole alpha beta thing. I think that I left that shit in 2020 and I wouldn't like to pick it back up. But getting a guy to give you kids and getting another guy to provide for them isn't a situation that a lot of women would like. They would like the guy that they idolize having a kid with or kids with would be able to provide for them and provide for them well. At least the last time I checked with the women that I talked to. But, if that's not the best case scenario, then probably for some, they may be open to the idea of having, the person that they idolize as kids with someone who's willing to provide. Not a good thing, particularly disgusting and quite dastardly of the women that do that, but yes, it is something that some have managed to do. But all in all, I might be wrong about some of this, if not most. But personally, out of everything that's been said here, my bullshit-o-meter is reading a 6 out of 10 bullshit. Mostly because the first half of everything that's been said is quite true, and it can fool a lot of people, more so men, into thinking that the other half is true, and yet it's not. So there's a bit of it that's true, but there's a lot of bullshit in there. So I'll give it a nice 6 out of 10, maybe 5 out of 10 for bullshit. But all in all, I am going to leave it at that and move it on to our very final tweet of this episode. So it says, and I quote, "Every girl has a big ass now, and the funniest part is the billionaires are still marrying skinny girls." End quote. And now, reading this, okay, let me give a little bit of context. This came after a photo of the Kenyan musician known as Saru was busy being posted online, where some of her ass was quite visible when she was busy doing a concert because she had a particular outfit which showed quite a bit of it. Of which, people always talk about Nyash. A lot of people have spoken about, having ass and babes today with ass and all. Since the ass talk is really, really what was bothering this guy, I feel like there's some issue in what the guy said. Now, of course, it's not like he's wrong. Yes, there are billionaires and they are still marrying skinny girls. But I wouldn't use that to be a particularly good metric, because if you look at most of the billionaires, they existed at a time, or at least most of them spent a good chunk of their years, or at least their youthful years, idolizing a different kind of babe as opposed to the people that are in their more youthful years right now. Let me explain. If you look at a good chunk of the billionaires that exist right now, most of them are extremely old, and the ones who aren't even that old spent a good chunk of their time in a period of time where the ideal beauty standard was between Marilyn Monroe and the current look of Kim Kardashian. Not the past one where she had a much bigger ass or anything, the right now one, which isn't too small. And as a result, they idolized smaller women. Those were the standards of beauty that were there. The so-called model look was a thing during that time. But fast forward to right now, where bigger women are getting preference. Women with bigger tits, bigger ass, a smaller waist, and nicer looking thighs are being preferred with wide hips and shit. It is definitely different from the beauty standards that were there back then, but it doesn't mean that just because that's the beauty standard right now, they're going to move with the times. People will mostly gravitate towards the periods where they had their most youthful times, or at least where they spent a good chunk of their lives living in. of which for a lot of these guys who are in their 50s and 60s, of course they'll prefer the smaller girls. And also, if you look at a lot of the billionaires, even though you were to make that argument, look at most of the babes that they bang on the side. A lot of them are the thick babes, but also the skinny ones as well. So either way, this argument using billionaires was particularly garbage. He could have just stated that the overemphasis on ass nowadays is a little bit overrated because there's definitely going to be a different beauty trend in another couple of years, but using billionaires, not the best metric to use, especially the ones who have a bunch of side hoes that are super thick. But then again, I might be wrong about this one, just the same I could be wrong about all the other tweets and many other things, so I want your thoughts on it. The DMs are open. On X it is at Bagaka the D, on Facebook it is at The Break Time Podcast, and on IG it is at The Break Time _podcast. Thank you so much for listening all the way till the end, and I will catch you guys on the next break.
But what I believe is that if you put a pastor and a prostitute in one room, one is likely to convert the other.